The Blackwater Hunger, Part 1, The Exposure. Chapter 1, The Parched Earth. The wind, what little there was, carried the smell of dust and dying hope. Havenwood always smelled of pine and damp earth, the rich aroma of a town nestled beside a generous body of water. Not anymore. Now it reeked of sun-baked mud and resignation. The Blackwater Reservoir, once the lifeblood and scenic jewel of their community, was a scar on the land, its once sparkling surface now a vast expanse of cracked, desiccated earth.
Sheriff Brody wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of gray dust. His uniform, usually crisp despite the small-town demands, felt like a sackcloth. The badge, a symbol of authority he rarely had to exert beyond breaking up bar fights and retrieving runaway pets, felt heavy and useless against the scale of this disaster. For generations, Havenwood had thrived. The reservoir, built in the early 1900s, had provided power, nurtured fertile fields, and drawn tourists with its tranquil beauty. Its depths had held not just water, but the promise of continuity. Now, that promise was as broken as the land. "Another week, Sheriff," Mayor Thompson had said, his voice raspy with defeat, "and we're done. The emergency wells are running dry. No rain in sight. We have to do it."
"Drain it completely?" Brody had asked, the words catching in his throat. It felt like a sacrilege, a final surrender. The mayor had simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant, shimmering heat haze above the reservoir's basin. "We're desperate. There's old talk, legends really, about springs in the valley before the reservoir was built. We have to look." And so the draining began, a slow, agonizing process. Each day, the water level receded further, exposing mudflats that had not seen the sun in over a century. The fish, trapped in shrinking puddles, became easy prey for opportunistic birds, a metaphor too stark to ignore. The air, once cool and moist, simmered with oppressive heat. Despair was a physical weight on Havenwood. Stores were closing, farmers watched their crops wither, and the laughter of children was a rare and precious sound. Brody drove his patrol car, a vehicle whose most exciting pursuits involved teenagers with stolen beer, through the quiet streets, his gaze constantly drawn to the receding waterline. He'd lived in Havenwood his entire life, inherited the sheriff's star from his father, and believed he knew every inch, every story, every secret of this town. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Chapter 2, Revelation. The call came mid-morning, relayed by a frantic Deputy Miller. "Sheriff, you need to get down here. You will not believe this." Miller's voice, usually steady, was high-pitched with awe and something else Brody couldn't quite place. Disbelief, perhaps, or a nascent horror. Brody arrived at the reservoir basin, dust kicking up from his tires, to find a small crowd already gathered. Engineers, town officials, and a few particularly brazen townsfolk stood at the edge of what was once the deepest part of the reservoir. The last trickles of water were indeed receding, gurgling weakly into the newly exposed, muddy channels that snaked towards the relief valves. And there it was, rising from the murky, clinging bottom of the basin, a skeletal silhouette against the hazy sky. It was a building, a massive multi-story structure, dark and menacing, its rusted metal frame gnawed by a century of submerged decay. It wasn't a house or a mill or any kind of industrial building Brody had ever seen in the historical records of Havenwood. "What in God's name?" Brody breathed, stepping forward, the mud squelching under his boots. Deputy Miller, pale-faced, gestured with a trembling hand. "It just appeared as the last of the water went down. It's huge, Sheriff, and it's a slaughterhouse." Brody squinted. Even from a distance, the shape was unmistakable. The high walls, the long chutes, the distinctive gabled roof, though much of it had collapsed. But it was far larger than any of the regional meatpacking plants he knew of, and incredibly ancient-looking. Moss and strange aquatic growths clung to its lower stories, giving it a monstrous, organic appearance. But that's impossible, Brody mumbled, more to himself than to Miller. The valley was uninhabited before the reservoir. That's what town history says. Just wilderness.
An engineer, a stern woman named Dr. Eris, who had been overseeing the draining, stepped forward, her face a mask of professional bewilderment. "We ran sonar scans of the basin before construction, Sheriff. There was nothing. Just a deep depression in the bedrock. This building should not exist." Brody's mind reeled. Havenwood, his Havenwood, meticulously documented since its founding in the early 1800s, every structure, every significant event. A building of this size, this scale, could not simply materialize out of thin air, nor could it have been so completely erased from memory. Yet here it stood, a dark, dripping testament to a colossal lie. He knew, with a sudden, icy knot in his stomach, that his days of chasing lost cats were definitively over.
Chapter 3. The Abattoir's Heart. The air inside the exposed structure was thick and cloying, a suffocating mixture of long stagnant water, metallic decay, and something else, something indescribably foul that seemed to cling to the very fabric of the air. Brody, along with Deputy Miller and Dr. Eris, pushed through a heavily rusted steel door that groaned in protest, its hinges frozen after a century of submersion. Flashlights cut feeble swaths through the gloom. The sheer scale of the building was even more horrifying from within. It was a labyrinth of rusting catwalks, broken machinery, and vast cavernous rooms. Water dripped from the ceiling, echoing in the oppressive silence, and the ground was a treacherous layer of thick black mud. But it wasn't the mud that seized them, nor the fallen beams, nor the skeletal remains of what might have been massive processing equipment. It was the walls. From floor to ceiling, in every room, every corridor, the walls were caked with layers of black, dried blood. It wasn't the uniform crimson of a freshly slaughtered animal. It was ancient, congealed, and seemed to have been applied in thick, deliberate coats, like some macabre wallpaper. It gleamed faintly in their flashlight beams, catching the light with a disturbingly viscous sheen. "Oh, God," Miller whispered, stumbling back, clapping a hand over his mouth. The smell here was overwhelming, coppery, putrid, and deeply unsettling. Dr. Eris, ever the scientist, took a step closer, her flashlight beam raking across the stained walls. "It's organic, but vast. What kind of operation?" Brody didn't answer. His gaze had fixed on something else. Etched into the rusted metal of a support beam, just beside a chute that led to a deeper, darker part of the building, were marks, tally marks, thousands upon thousands of them, each group of 5 painstakingly carved, not crudely, but with an unnerving precision. They weren't straight, even lines. The final crosshatch mark in each group of 5 was subtly skewed, the depth of the grooves uneven, as if pressed by something with an odd, almost awkward grip. Something with too many fingers. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. This wasn't just a slaughterhouse, it was a chronicle, each mark a grotesque tick on a monstrous calendar. What exactly had been counted here? And how many? They found no bodies, no bones, nothing that could provide a definitive answer to the what or the who. Only the blood, the machinery designed for unseen horrors, and those marks. The sheer volume of them suggested a scale of death beyond comprehension. Back outside, the sun felt harsh, the air cleaner, yet the stench of the abattoir clung to Brody's clothes, his hair, his very skin. He drove back to his office in a haze, the images burned into his mind. Later that afternoon, a slender woman with intelligent eyes and an eager researcher's gleam in them introduced herself. "Sheriff Brody? Sarah Jenkins. I'm a local historian, and I just heard about this." She gestured vaguely towards the basin. "I've been studying Havenwood's founding, and this is revolutionary. I need to get in there. There's no mention of anything like this in any of the town archives. This could rewrite everything we know."
Brody looked at her innocent academic curiosity. He saw the fire in her eyes, the thirst for discovery. He also saw, for the first time, a potential victim. He tried to dissuade her, citing safety concerns, the unstable structure, but Sarah was tenacious. "Sheriff, this is my life's work. A structure like that, lying hidden for a century? It's a gold mine. Imagine what secrets it holds about our founders." Brody relented, but only with the strict condition that she be accompanied by Deputy Miller. He watched her go, a sense of foreboding settling in his chest. The tally marks, too many of them, the uneven pattern. It felt less like a record of industry and more like a ledger of hunger.
Part 2. The Awakening. Chapter 4. Thump-squelch. That night, Havenwood slept fitfully. The discovery of the slaughterhouse had sent a tremor of unease through the town. Whispers of curses, dark omens, and ancient spirits circulated faster than the dwindling water supply. Brody, in his small, quiet house, found sleep elusive. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of the parched leaves outside, seemed amplified. He kept seeing the blood-caked walls, the endless tally marks. Then he heard it. A sound that wasn't the wind, not the house settling, not the distant howl of a coyote. It was low, rhythmic, and impossibly heavy. Thump-squelch, thump-squelch. It seemed to emanate from the valley, carrying with it a faint, cloying smell that permeated the night air, like stagnant water and something rotten, something ancient.
He dismissed it as imagination, a lingering effect of the day's horrors, the wind playing tricks on the exposed mud of the basin. The next morning, Farmer McGregor's prize dairy cow was found dead. Brody drove out, his stomach churning even before he saw it. The scene was sickeningly precise. The cow hadn't been torn apart by predators. Its skin had been peeled back, meticulously, almost surgically, revealing the musculature beneath. Its organs had been removed, not ripped, but artfully extracted, leaving only hollow cavities. McGregor, a burly man who had seen his share of farm accidents and coyote attacks, stood trembling, a shotgun clutched uselessly in his hands. It wasn't an animal, Sheriff. No tracks. Just this. And that smell, like old fear, sticking to everything. Brody knelt, examining the grim handiwork. The sheer, unnatural precision of the flaying was what truly disturbed him. No human could do this, not without extensive training and specialized tools, and certainly not without leaving a trace. No known animal could either. Over the next few days, more livestock deaths followed. Each one bore the same chilling signature: flayed flesh, artfully removed organs, and always that strange, cloying smell lingered in the air, a scent Brody was starting to associate with the very essence of dread. The thump-squelch sound grew bolder, closer than the valley. Some townsfolk claimed to hear it at night, just outside their homes, a heavy, wet rhythm passing by their windows. Panic, a cold, insidious dread, began to take root in Havenwood. Brody tried to reassure people, to offer rational explanations, a new, unknown predator, a cult perhaps, but even his own words sounded hollow. He knew, deep down, that rational explanations had abandoned Havenwood, along with its water. Chapter 5. Sarah's Descent. Sarah Jenkins, initially thrilled by the historical gold mine she had unearthed, quickly became consumed by it. She spent every waking hour in her small, cluttered office, surrounded by stacks of books, maps, and microfiche printouts from the town archives. Deputy Miller had accompanied her on several initial trips into the slaughterhouse, but she soon started venturing in alone, captivated by the gruesome puzzle. Brody would often find her in the sheriff's office, poring over old ledgers, her face smudged with dust and grim determination. "Sheriff," she'd say, her voice hushed with awe and growing terror, "there's nothing, absolutely nothing about that building. Not in tax records, not in deeds,
Not in the original survey maps. It's like it was wiped clean from history. She started digging deeper, past the official records, into the personal journals and letters of Havenwood's earliest settlers. These were harder to find, often locked away in forgotten attics or donated to obscure historical societies. She became more frantic, more isolated. Her eager gleam was replaced by a haunted, distant look. She spoke in hushed tones about gaps in the town's history, about convenient omissions.
"They knew something, Sheriff," she insisted one evening, her eyes wide. "The founders. They moved here for the land, yes, but there are hints in these old letters, whispers of a local problem in the valley before they even laid out the town. Vague references to the thing in the hollow or the valley spirit." Brody tried to calm her, but he couldn't deny the chilling implications. Her research was mirroring his own growing dread about the tally marks and the flayed livestock. The thump-squelch had been heard near Sarah's house 2 nights prior. "Sarah, be careful," he urged. "This isn't just history anymore. There's something moving out there." She just stared at him, her gaze unsettlingly fixed. "Yes, Sheriff, and I think it's been moving for a very, very long time."
Her journal, which she always carried, filled with increasingly frantic notes. Sketches of the tally marks, cross-referenced with lunar cycles and ancient agricultural calendars. Scrawled theories about the meaning of the blood, the purpose of the abattoir. The last entries grew almost unreadable, filled with desperate questions and terrifying hypotheses. She spoke of a hungry occupant, a pre-settlement terror. Brody felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition that Sarah was getting too close. He called her, stopped by her house, but she was always engrossed, always just on the edge of a breakthrough. She was chasing a ghost, and he feared that ghost was about to catch her.
Chapter 6. The Vanishing. The empty plate sat on the kitchen table, a half-eaten sandwich growing stale. The kettle, cold now, stood beside it, a forgotten tea bag still steeping in the mug. The curtains were drawn, the morning light filtering weakly through the cracks. Sheriff Brody stood in Sarah Jenkins's modest home, a sickening premonition twisting in his gut. He'd arrived after her frantic calls went unanswered, after her next-door neighbor reported an unusual silence from the usually busy historian's house. The silence was the first thing that struck him, a heavy, unnatural quiet that pressed in from all sides. The second was the smell. Faint, but unmistakable, the cloying scent of stagnant water and old fear, just like the scent clinging to the flayed livestock. It was stronger here, almost present, as if whatever produced it had lingered.
He walked into her study, the room a chaotic explosion of books and papers. Her journal lay open on her desk, its pages filled with frantic, nearly illegible script. He picked it up, his fingers brushing against the still damp ink of the last entry. The ledger. There has to be one. Something kept records. Not human. The marks. Too many fingers. The offerings. It wasn't just trapped. It was fed. The words trailed off into a series of jagged, angry scribbles. There was no sign of a struggle. No broken furniture. No overturned lamps. It was as if Sarah had simply stepped away from her meal, from her research, and vanished into thin air.
Brody called in Deputy Miller and every available volunteer. They fanned out through Havenwood, searching every alley, every abandoned building, every inch of the parched landscape surrounding the town. They found nothing. No footprints, no tire tracks that weren't already accounted for. Just the pervasive, faint smell, clinging like a shroud to the air around Sarah's house, and slowly dissipating as they moved further away. Panic seized Havenwood like a wildfire. Livestock deaths were one thing. A person, a respected member of the community, vanishing without a trace, leaving behind only the lingering scent of an unknown horror and a journal filled with terrifying insights. That was different. That pushed them past fear and into abject terror.
The thump-squelch was no longer dismissed as wind or imagination. It was real, it was louder, and it was no longer confined to the valley. Now, people heard it closer, just outside their homes, especially at night.
A heavy, wet rhythm, drawing closer and closer, like the inexorable march of a terrible, long-due bill. Havenwood was no longer merely threatened by drought. It was being hunted.
Part 3. The Truth Unveiled. Chapter 7. The Forgotten Ledger. Brody locked himself in his office for 2 days, the scent of fear and damp earth seeping into his clothes. Sarah's journal was spread out before him, its frantic words a testament to her final terror and her near discovery. The ledger. There has to be one. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Sarah had been on the verge of uncovering a secret Havenwood had buried for over a century. He started tearing through his own archives, not the official, sanitized ones, but the dusty boxes tucked away in the back of the station, filled with his father's and grandfather's old papers, forgotten files, and personal effects.
He found it late on the second night. A small, leather-bound ledger, brittle with age, its cover faded and unmarked. It wasn't an official document, more a personal diary or record book. The handwriting inside was spidery, almost illegible, but Brody recognized it from some of his grandfather's old letters. It was the hand of Elias Thorne, one of Havenwood's original founders. He began to read, his flashlight beam trembling on the crumbling pages. The early entry spoke of the challenges of settling the valley, the promising land, the abundant water. But then the tone shifted.
October 12th, 1817. Heard the sound again tonight, the heavy, wet passing in the hollow. Lost another heifer. Not torn like wolf work. Flayed. Henry Jr. says it was quick, clean. Something unnatural. November 3rd, 1817. More sightings. Shadows moving in the deep woods. The children are frightened. Whispers among the folk of the valley's hunger. Dismissed as superstition, but my own stomach turns. The ledger went on, charting a horrifying pattern of livestock vanishings, and eventually a few unexplained disappearances of settlers who ventured too far into the valley. The descriptions of the flaying chilled Brody, echoing the horror he'd seen recently.
Then came the entry that made his blood run cold. April 1st, 1820. We built it, the abattoir, a place of propitiation. It demanded sustenance. The valley will not yield its bounty without its due. We have made a pact, a terrible pact. The structure is built over the deepest part of the hollow, where it dwells. We will feed it. We will keep it from the town. The too many fingers will count its meals, and so long as they are provided, Havenwood will prosper. Brody dropped the ledger, his hands shaking so violently he almost couldn't pick it up again. The abattoir, the slaughterhouse. It wasn't for cattle, it was a propitiation site. And the too many fingers, the uneven tally marks. The creature wasn't just a myth, it was real, and it had been there long before Havenwood.
Chapter 8. The Price of Peace. Brody continued reading Thorne's ledger, each entry peeling back another layer of Havenwood's horrifying past. July 14th, 1825. The peace holds. The offerings are being delivered, as agreed. The valley is safe. But the cost weighs heavy on our souls. The creature sleeps, satiated, but its hunger is vast. We must be vigilant. The ledger detailed how the founders, desperate to build their prosperous town in a valley they had discovered was already claimed by an ancient evil, had struck a deal. They would build the slaughterhouse, contain the entity within the deepest part of the hollow, and feed it in return for its dormancy. The tally marks were indeed its grotesque calendar, counting its meals, measuring the intervals between its awakenings.
Then came the entries about the reservoir. The official history stated it was built for power and flood control in the early 1900s. Thorne's ledger, passed down through generations of a select few families, told a different story. March 10th, 1903. The valley grows restless. The creature's slumber is less deep. We fear its hunger is growing beyond what we can sustainably offer.
A new plan has been devised. A grand project. October 22nd, 1904. The Great Dam is complete. The waters rise. The abattoir, along with its hungry occupant, will be submerged. Contained. The vastness of the water will keep its hunger at bay, and regular offerings can be made to the depths, ensuring its continued dormancy. The waters will be its prison, its blanket, and its continuous sustenance. May God forgive us, for this is the only way to ensure Havenwood's future.
The reservoir wasn't just for power. It was a massive, watery prison, a containment unit. The flooding of the valley wasn't just an engineering feat. It was a desperate, generational act of concealment and continued propitiation. The constant flow of water, the occasional accidental drownings, perhaps even deliberate small offerings tossed into the depths, these were the new meals, the new tallies in the murky darkness. Brody felt a profound nausea. Havenwood hadn't prospered through hard work and ingenuity alone. Its peace, its very existence, had been built on a terrible, continuous pact with a monstrous entity. All these years, the water had been flowing, the reservoir had been full, and Havenwood had lived in blissful, ignorant prosperity, sustained by the endless sacrifice of its hidden horror. The drought, the complete draining. It hadn't merely exposed a forgotten building. It had shattered the prison. It had revealed the terrible truth. And it had awakened an ancient hunger, a creature that had been fed for centuries, its larder now suddenly, catastrophically empty. Chapter 9. Echoes in the Dark. The truth, once revealed, was a crushing weight. Brody tried to share it, to warn the others, but the words sounded insane, even to his own ears. Ancient evil, propitiation, a creature with too many fingers. Mayor Thompson listened with a look of stunned disbelief, then anger. "Sheriff, you're talking nonsense. Hallucinations from stress. We need a plan, not ghost stories." But the evidence was mounting. The wet footsteps now grew impossibly bolder. They were no longer just in the basin or on the outskirts. People swore they saw movement in the shadows, heard the thump-squelch right outside their windows, followed by the faint, cloying smell. Children, too young to understand the specifics, knew something was wrong. They drew monstrous figures with elongated, grasping limbs. They whispered of a hungry shadow that walked at night. Mrs. Albright, the town baker, found her cat flayed on her porch, its organs precisely removed. A gruesome calling card. The next day, a dog disappeared, then another. The townsfolk barricaded themselves in their homes, turning their once welcoming houses into fortresses of fear. Shotguns, usually reserved for hunting deer, were now trained on empty doorways. The stores closed permanently. The roads out of Havenwood, once quiet, bottlenecked with desperate families fleeing the terror, their cars loaded with what little they could salvage.
Brody felt a terrible responsibility. He was the sheriff. He was supposed to protect them. But how do you protect a town from something that has been patiently feeding on its history, something that had been patiently waiting beneath its prosperity for over a century? The creature wasn't just hungry. It was intelligent. It was methodical. It was harvesting. And Havenwood, having broken its ancient pact, was the harvest.
Part 4. The Harvest. Chapter 10. The First Offering. The terror escalated from livestock to humans with a horrifying inevitability. Old Man Hemlock lived alone on the far side of Havenwood, a cantankerous hermit. No one checked on him for days until the stench of the cloying fear became undeniable, even at a distance. Brody and Miller found him in his home, much like the cattle, flayed. His skin peeled back, meticulously, almost reverently. His organs removed, leaving a hollowed-out cavity. The precision was what broke Miller. He vomited into a bucket, tears streaming down his face. "It's doing it again, Sheriff," he choked out. "Just like the animals. My God, what is this thing?" Brody could only shake his head, his own stomach churning. The horror wasn't just in the death, but in the artistry of it. It wasn't random butchery. It was a chillingly deliberate act, almost a ritual. The tally marks in the abattoir, the detailed removal of organs. It wasn't just eating, it was collecting. That night, the thump-squelch was louder than ever. It echoed through the emptying streets, a mournful drumbeat against the silence of the night. People huddled in their homes, too terrified to even whisper. The power flickered, then died, plunging Havenwood into an even deeper, more primal darkness. The generator at the old hydroelectric plant, now useless, had finally given out. Fear was a tangible thing, a heavy blanket over the town. Every shadow held menace. Every rustle of leaves was a potential threat. The faint, cloying smell was now everywhere, a constant reminder of the unseen predator.
The creature was no longer merely on the outskirts. It was in the very heart of Havenwood. Chapter 11. Desperate Measures. Brody tried to organize a defense. He gathered the remaining townsfolk, a dwindling number of about 24, mostly those too old, too stubborn, or too terrified to leave. He issued rifles, shotguns, whatever they had. "We need to stick together," he urged, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "Barricade the community center. We'll try to make it through the night." But how do you fight something you cannot see? Something that moves with unnatural silence despite its heavy tread. Something that has centuries of practice in hunting. A few young men, fueled by whiskey and misplaced bravery, tried to venture out to hunt the thing down. They never returned. Their screams were brief, cut short, followed by the sickening, wet sounds of something being stripped and collected. More people fled, some driving off into the darkness, others attempting to walk, their terrified whispers swallowed by the vast empty basin. Havenwood, once a vibrant community, was shrinking, dissolving under the relentless pressure of an ancient hunger. Brody felt useless, overwhelmed. His training, his experience, meant nothing against this. This wasn't a criminal. This wasn't a lost dog. This was something primordial, something that predated humanity, something that had merely been inconvenienced by their presence. He thought of Sarah, of her frantic notes, of Elias Thorne's chilling ledger. They had broken a pact, and now the bill had come due. The thought of reflooding the reservoir surfaced, a desperate, impossible idea. But without power, without the engineers, without a way to divert a river that no longer existed, it was a fantasy. They were trapped.
Chapter 12. Sarah's Legacy. Brody returned to Sarah's house. He had to find something, anything, a clue she might have missed, a last-ditch effort. The house was cold and empty, the smell of fear still lingering like a ghost. He searched again, more thoroughly this time, tearing apart bookshelves, pulling out drawers. Beneath a loose floorboard in her study, he found it, a small, tightly wrapped bundle of papers, separate from her main journal. These were not her notes, but copies of what appeared to be the earliest parts of Elias Thorne's ledger, along with some additional, even older, fragmented documents she must have found. One particular document, yellowed and brittle, was a crude map of the valley, dating back before the town's founding. It showed the hollow where the abattoir stood, marked with an ominous, stylized symbol. And beside it, in barely legible script, a phrase: "It slumbers deeply when the waters are high. Its hunger is tempered by the constant flow. But when the currents cease and the stone of its prison is bare, it demands its due with an awakened fury. The cycle must not break. The source, the spring of the ancient woods, it must never run dry if the waters fail." Brody's breath hitched. The source. The valley had been chosen for the reservoir site because of a powerful natural spring system that fed the Blackwater River. The drought had dried it,
but perhaps a deep, hidden part of it still flowed?
Sarah's last frantic notes, scrawled on the back of the map, made the connection explicit. The founders didn't just flood it, they tapped into the main spring, diverted its flow into the reservoir itself. The water wasn't just a prison, it was a continuous offering, a constant dilute mail. And then, a terrifying thought. If the spring could be sealed, cut off from the main basin, perhaps the creature would be denied its full sustenance, would retreat into a deeper slumber. Or it would go into a frenzy. It wasn't a solution, but a choice. A terrible, desperate choice. Either try to restore the constant flow that placated it, or try to cut off all its sustenance, hoping to force it back into dormancy, but risking an even greater, more immediate rage. He looked at the map, at the crudely marked location of what appeared to be the primary spring, deep within the now exposed basin, just beyond the abattoir. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only option left. Havenwood had built its peace on a terrible pact. Now, with the larder empty and the truth exposed, Brody knew he had to face the creature. Not to kill it, for how do you kill something that ancient? But to try and honor, or perhaps rewrite the pact. The source, the spring, the Blackwater Hunger was coming, and Brody was going to meet it.
Part 5. The Reckoning. Chapter 13. Confrontation. Brody gathered the last few able-bodied survivors, Deputy Miller, a grizzled old farmer named Jedediah, and a quiet, resourceful woman named Clara, who had lost her entire family. Their faces were etched with fear, but also a grim, desperate resolve. They were armed, but Brody knew their weapons were largely symbolic. "We're going to the spring," Brody explained, unfolding Sarah's map. "The one that feeds the reservoir. It's marked here, past the slaughterhouse. Sarah's notes suggest it's the key to the creature's dormancy. Either we re-establish its flow, or we cut it off completely, force it back down." "And what if it's there, Sheriff?" Jedediah asked, his voice low. "What if it's waiting for us?" Brody met his gaze. "Then we give it what it wants, or we try to send it back to hell."
They moved out under the cover of a moonless night, the air thick with dust and the lingering, cloying smell. The thump-squelch was omnipresent now, a constant, heavy pulse in the darkness, seemingly coming from all directions. It was a sound that now filled them with a cold understanding of its purpose, the sound of a predator moving through its hunting ground. They skirted the edge of the exposed reservoir basin, the mud underfoot treacherous and sucking. The skeletal frame of the abattoir loomed in the distance, a dark, gaping maw against the bruised sky. As they drew closer to the spring's location, near the base of the basin walls, the thump-squelch grew louder, closer. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of decay. A low, guttural gurgle echoed from the darkness ahead. "It's here," Miller whispered, his hand shaking on his rifle. "Dear God, it's here." Chapter 14. The Maw of Havenwood. The spring was not a gentle trickle. It was a grotto, partially carved out by the constant flow of water, now exposed to the air. A powerful dark stream still flowed from a crack in the rock, pooling into a muddy sump before disappearing into the earth. And beside it, in the murky, moonless light, was the creature. Brody didn't scream. He couldn't. His mind simply recoiled from the impossibility of it. It was colossal, easily 15 feet tall, though its form seemed to shift and writhe, making its true dimensions difficult to discern. It was a mockery of something vaguely humanoid, but grotesque, cobbled together from sinew and shadow, slick with black, oily moisture that glistened in the scant light. Its skin, if it could be called that, was a mottled gray-green, like ancient waterlocked stone, but subtly moving, like muscles beneath a shroud.
Its head was elongated, eyeless, but sensing, turning in their direction with an unnerving, predatory focus. And its hands were a horror from a nightmare. Multiple digits, not fingers exactly, but long, segmented appendages, too many of them, splayed and writhing like a cluster of pale predatory worms. They ended in chitinous, razor-sharp claws, still dripping with a dark, viscous fluid. The too many fingers from the ledger, the explanation for the uneven tally marks, were now terrifyingly real. It was tearing at something near the spring, something small and indistinct, flaying it with sickening precision, its head tilted as if listening to the sounds of its own gruesome work. The thump-squelch with its own gait, the sound of its heavy, wet body moving through the mud.
Jedediah screamed then, a raw animal sound of pure terror, and fired his shotgun. The blast echoed in the basin, a futile gesture. The creature barely flinched. It turned its eyeless head fully towards them, and a sound, a wet, clicking shriek, tore through the night. A sound that seemed to scrape against the very edge of sanity. It moved, faster than anything so massive had a right to, churning through the mud with its grotesque, multi-digited hands, a silent, horrifying wave of ancient malevolence. "The spring!" Brody yelled, pulling out the satchel of explosives he'd brought, a desperate last resort. "We have to seal it! Cut it off!" Miller and Clara, galvanized by terror and Brody's desperate command, moved towards the spring, scrambling over rocks and mud. Brody aimed his rifle, firing a desperate volley, trying to draw its attention. The bullets impacted the creature's shifting form with dull thuds, doing nothing.
The creature lunged, its impossibly long arms reaching, its segmented fingers splaying open. It moved with a terrifying, liquid grace, like a horror from the deep now unleashed on land. Brody felt a searing pain as one of its claws raked across his arm, tearing flesh and uniform. He fell, dropping his rifle, the cloying smell overwhelming. He looked up, seeing its grotesque head hovering over him, its multiple fingers reaching. He wasn't just going to die, he was going to be harvested. Then, a sudden, blinding flash. Clara, with grim determination, had managed to ignite one of the charges and toss it into the fissure of the spring. The explosion ripped through the grotto, sending a shower of rock and mud into the air.
The creature shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony and rage. It recoiled, its form thrashing, momentarily distracted. The flow of the spring visibly lessened, choked by the falling debris and the shattered bedrock. "More!" Brody screamed, pulling himself to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his arm. "Seal it off! All of it!" Miller, with a newfound ferocity, began planting the remaining charges, his hands smeared with mud and fear. The creature, its attention divided between the sealing spring and the irritating humans, moved with a terrifying, frustrated fury. It lashed out, its claws catching Jedediah, who barely had time to scream before he was silently dragged into the darkness, his weapon clattering uselessly to the ground.
Brody and Miller lit the last of the charges simultaneously. The basin erupted in a series of concussive blasts. The grotto crumbled, tons of rock and earth raining down, effectively sealing the primary spring, cutting off the continuous, dilute offering that had sustained the creature for centuries. The creature let out a final, ear-splitting shriek, a sound of ancient, profound hunger and betrayal, as the water source dwindled to a choked trickle, then nothing. Its form seemed to shudder, to shrink, to recoil into itself. It didn't disappear, not entirely. It simply became less active, less present. Its dark, shifting mass melted deeper into the darkness of the ruined grotto, a shadow clinging to the shattered lock, its monstrous fingers still twitching with lingering hunger.
The thump-squelch ceased. The cloying smell dissipated, replaced by the acrid scent of gunpowder and dust. Silence descended on the basin, a heavier, more profound silence than before. They had sealed the spring. They had denied the creature its sustenance. But Brody knew, with a terrifying certainty, that they hadn't killed it. They had merely forced it into a deeper, starved slumber, a dormancy born of deprivation rather than satiation. The cycle had not broken. It had merely been prolonged. Chapter 15.
the new pact. Brody and Miller, battered and broken, stumbled out of the basin as dawn broke, the first rays of sun painting the broken landscape in hues of grim gray and blood orange. Clara, miraculously, was still with them, her face streaked with tears and mud, but alive. Havenwood was a ghost town. The few remaining residents, seeing the sunrise and hearing the blessed silence, began to emerge from their homes, their faces pale, their eyes haunted. They looked at Brody, at the blood on his uniform, at the shattered remains of their town, and knew. There was no formal announcement, no grand declaration. The truth, in its raw, horrifying simplicity, settled over Havenwood. They had lived for centuries on a terrible pact, and now that pact was broken, or rather, twisted into something new, something colder. The spring was sealed. The creature, for now, was dormant, trapped deep within the shattered grotto, starved, but not dead. It would wake again, in time. Its hunger was ancient, eternal.
The engineers, the government officials, they came, confused by the sealed spring, the strange stories, the sheer devastation. Brody showed them Thorne's ledger, Sarah's notes. They looked at him with pity, with disbelief, with a dawning horror that they quickly tried to rationalize away. No one wanted to believe. No one could believe. Havenwood was declared a disaster zone, uninhabitable. The drought had exposed too much, had broken too much. The lack of water was just the start. The remaining residents left, carrying their few possessions, their shattered lives, and the indelible mark of the Blackwater Hunger in their eyes. The town was abandoned, a monument to a forgotten evil. Brody stayed. He couldn't leave. He was the last guardian of the pact, the reluctant keeper of Havenwood's terrible secret. He knew the creature would awaken again. Its hunger was simply postponed, not sated.
He rebuilt a small cabin near the now shattered spring grotto, a solitary vigil. He started a new ledger, a grim, personal chronicle. He would watch. He would wait. And when the whispers began again, when the thump-squelch returned, he would be there. He would find a way, however terrible, to ensure the new pact held. The creature was starved, not sated. It was a ticking clock. And the silence, the profound, echoing silence over the dried-up basin, was no longer a comfort. It was a promise of the hunger yet to come. Epilogue. Years passed. The drought eventually broke, though Havenwood remained a ghost town. The Blackwater Reservoir slowly, inexorably began to fill again, fed by the revitalized spring system and years of rain. The water rose, creeping over the cracked earth, slowly submerging the ruins of the abattoir once more. The skeletal structure faded beneath the tranquil surface, a forgotten nightmare sinking back into the depths.
Sheriff Brody, a gray-haired, solitary figure, was rarely seen. He lived by the reservoir now, in a small, isolated cabin, maintaining his lonely vigil. He cast offerings into the water sometimes, small, symbolic things, for he knew the true sustenance was the water itself, the vast, cold blanket that kept the ancient hunger at bay. He knew the creature was down there, waiting, its metabolism slowed, its ancient fury banked, but not extinguished. The water was its prison. The water was its offering. Havenwood was gone, a name whispered with a shudder in neighboring towns, a place abandoned to its history. But the reservoir, once a symbol of prosperity, was now a monument to a terrible peace bought at an unimaginable price.
Brody often sat by the shore, watching the placid surface, sometimes hearing or imagining he heard the faint, deep murmur from beneath the waves. The thump-squelch was gone now, replaced by the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. But he knew it was still there, and he knew that one day, perhaps in another 100 years, perhaps sooner if the earth grew parched again, if the waters receded, the Blackwater Hunger would rise, and the bill
long overdue, would come due once more.